This summer, we worked with the Early Social Interaction Psychology Lab to investigate adult evaluations of acts of force across different contexts. And what we did was a pilot study to a larger study focusing on how preschoolers develop their evaluation to force in different everyday contexts. So humans' general aversion to force is crucial to a peaceful coexistence. Without this aversion towards acts of force, our society would be engulfed in chaos. As such, understanding how people come to view force as wrong is vital to society. One group that is particularly interesting to study is preschoolers, because children have been found to start developing an aversion to force about at that age. In addition, while people overwhelmingly evaluate acts of force negatively, they still engage in it in contexts such as self-defense, contact sports, or rough play. For example, watch this video. So that was a funny video, and this video is interesting to me because the two boys and the adults seem to be enjoying themselves, and if you could hear, the adults were actually encouraging them to continue in the pillow fight. I would guess that at least some of the people in the room would be fine with the acts of force going on. So therefore, this study's primary motivation was to explore how adults evaluate acts of force in everyday contexts. Specifically, we looked at play, self-defense, stolen item, and unprovoked contexts, because these contexts are contexts that preschoolers may actually encounter in their day-to-day activities. So before we actually get into the study methodology and results, I'd like to present some relevant literature on this topic, just to give you some context. First of all, there's currently a gap in the literature. Most past studies have looked into how and why people negatively judge force against others, but don't actually consider a variety of contexts such as rough play or teasing, which we consider. This is also one of the main reasons we chose this research topic. So first of all, Nucci and Turiel conducted a very similar study to our study in 2009. They looked into the development of moral reasoning for different force contexts for children aged 7 to 16 and found significant differences in evaluations of right or wrong for different contexts. This is also the result we are hypothesizing for our study, which we'll get to later. Another piece of relevant literature comes from Dahl and Frieda in 2017 when they studied components to an aversion to harming. They found that the main components, which were threefold: understanding that force causes pain, avoiding pain in others, and negatively evaluating actions that cause pain, mostly began developing by the age of 2. Finally, there's been some research done on specific contexts that we've looked at in this study. Past research has suggested that preschoolers engage in force during play quite often, and that boys engage in it more often than girls. In fact, one study found that most 6 to 11-year-olds found it wrong to play a game that involved bumping others on the head. For force in response to stolen property, past research suggests that at least by 3 years of age, children are able to understand property rights and protest when another's property is being thrown away. Starting by at least 2 years of age, children purposefully engage in force to defend their possessions. For force in self-defense, we actually know very little on children's responses. One study found that older children aged 8 to 12 more positively evaluated acts of force that were done in self-defense than in other contexts. So now we're going to move on to our actual study, starting with our research questions.
Our main research questions for this study were: how do adults evaluate hypothetical force actions across play, self-defense, stolen item, and unprovoked context? We also hypothesized that the self-defense and the play context would be more higher evaluated than stolen item and unprovoked context. Our second question was: what alternative actions do adults propose in order to avoid acts of force? To explore our research questions, we presented hypothetical vignettes depicting preschoolers engaging in acts of force across 4 different contexts. We used a within-subject design as all of our participants saw all 4 contexts. Our sample included 32 undergraduate students from a large Western university with a mean age of 21. Our sample included mostly females, as we only had 5 males compared to 27 females. To address the concerns about order and gender, the order of the vignettes and the gender of the transgressors were counterbalanced. The 4 contexts we presented were forces that occurred during play, stolen item context, self-defense context, and an unprovoked context. To give you a sense of what the participants experienced, here is a similar example to what the participants would have been read. Kevin is at his preschool. Kevin and Allie are playing with toys while standing around a table. Kevin and Allie are playing a game together where they try to hit each other with stuffed animals. During the game, Kevin hits Allie's chest with the stuffed animal. Participants were not shown this specific vignette, but were shown vignettes representing all 4 contexts. Also keep in mind that we kept these vignettes simple as the study was meant to be done on preschool students, although it was done with adults here. We did this to validate the design before we interviewed the preschoolers. Following these vignettes, interviewers followed a structured interview to assess the undergraduates' evaluations and justifications about the vignettes. We asked, do you think it was okay that the transgressor did that? And what alternative actions could the victim have taken instead of the act of force? One of the major tasks Justin and I had over the summer was to create a coding scheme so that we can categorize and analyze the open-ended statements that we received from the participants. To do this, we took participant responses and organized them into separate categories. For instance, if a participant suggested that a preschooler should seek adult help, then we coded that as adult consultation. After going through a majority of the responses, we created a coding manual which encompassed all of the categories we created along with concrete definitions and examples. In order to reliably categorize, we established reliability by coding 20% of the data, and both of us agreed at a high enough accuracy.
So now we're going to move on. So now we're going to move on to the results of our pilot study, starting from evaluations of whether or not the use of force was okay with each context. In this graph on the screen, we see that both the game context and the self-defense context yielded relatively high percentages of people who said that they were okay, 60% and 51% respectively. On the other hand, the property context and the unprovoked context were much lower, at 11% okay rate and 6% respectively. This does line up with our hypothesis and suggests that many people believe that using force in self-defense or while playing a rough game is actually justifiable. Moving on to our alternative action results, which you can see on this graph. As you can see, restraint, communication, command, and adult help were the 4 most commonly cited alternative actions across all contexts. Restraint, which was coded when participants said something along the lines of, "The child should not have hit the other child and just played nicely," was used 11.7% of the time. Communication, where adults said that the child should talk with the other child, was used 33.2% of the time. Command, in which the participant said that the child should command the other child to give the toy back, for example, was used 16.7% of the time. Finally, adult help, where the child should ask an adult for help, was coded 8.7% of the time. We can see from this graph that communication was by far the most common response, and that most of the common alternative actions were actually non-violent. They didn't suggest hitting the child back, for example. Next, let's talk about the most common alternatives for each context. As you can see, the most common alternative actions for game are alternative activity, no violence, and physical restraint. The most common alternative actions for the self-defense context were communication, command, and adult help. For property context, the most common 3 were communication, command, and alternative activity, and the most common responses for the unprovoked context were communication, physical restraint, and alternative activity. Also, just a quick note that these numbers might add up to more than 100% because participants could code multiple codes, provide multiple responses. So we start to notice several interesting trends in this chart. First of all, participants actually gave very similar responses to each situation. To give you guys some context, there were 8 different codes in total, but as you can see in this graph, the top 3 codes encompassed most of the responses for all 4 contexts. In addition, we can see that communication was by far the most common response in each situation besides the game situation, where it was actually very uncommon. So this data mostly answers our research question on what alternative activities adults give to solve 4 scenarios. So those were the main results of our pilot study, and now we're going to move on to our future directions. So as previously stated, this was a pilot study done to validate our design to interview preschoolers, which is the actual study. Data collection with preschoolers is currently ongoing. We also want to follow up the study by utilizing naturalistic videos instead of hypothetical vignettes, because we think that it would offer more information than the written vignettes and would represent children's day-to-day experiences much more accurately. We're also interested to see if there are any community differences and how preschoolers from different communities evaluate force across different contexts. We are especially interested to explore communities in which it might be more necessary to engage in acts of force in order to defend oneself or one's property more often.
That concludes our presentation. Thanks everyone for listening, and a special thank you to the ESIL lab, the AOP team, our mentor Charles, our secondary mentor Talia Waltzer, Rhea and Ashley, the SIP staff, and the psychology department. We are now open to any questions.